Swann's Way, Swann in Love, Part 3, by Marcel Proust. But none of these people who professed to admire this musician, when Swann had said that the sonata was really beautiful, Madame Védéran had claimed, "I quite believe it, beautiful indeed. But people don't dare to confess that they don't know Vinteuil's sonata. They have no right not to know it." And the painter added, "Ah, yes, it's absolutely a work of genius, isn't it? Not, of course, if you want something sweet and popular, but I mean to say, it makes a very great impression on us artists." None of them seemed ever to have asked himself these questions, for none was able to reply. Even to one or two particular remarks made by Swann on his favorite phrase. "Do you know, that's a funny thing. I had never noticed it. I may as well tell you that I don't much care about peering at things through a microscope and pricking myself on pinpoints of difference. No, we don't waste time splitting hairs. It's not our style," replied Madame Védéran, whom Dr. Cottard watched with open-mouthed admiration and a studious zeal as she skipped lightly from one stepping stone to another of her stock of ready-made phrases. Both he, however, and Madame Cottard, with a kind of common sense that is shared by many people of humble origin, would always take care not to express an opinion or to pretend to admire a piece of music that they would confess to each other once they were at home no more understood than they could understand the art of Master Biche. Inasmuch as the public cannot recognize the charm, the beauty, even the outlines of nature, save in the stereotyped impressions of an art that they have gradually assimilated. While an original artist starts by rejecting those impressions, so M. and Madame Cottard, typical in this respect of the public, were incapable of finding, either in Vinteuil's sonata or in Biche's portraits, what constituted harmony for them in music or beauty in painting. It appeared to them, when the pianist played his sonata, as though he were striking haphazard from the piano notes that bore no relation to the musical forms to which they were accustomed, and that the painter simply flung the colors haphazard on his canvas. When on one of these they were able to distinguish a human form, they always found it heavy and vulgarized, that is to say, lacking all the elegance of the school of painting through which they were in the habit of seeing in the street real living people, and devoid of truth, as though Monsieur Biche had not known how a shoulder was constructed, or that women don't have mauve hair. And yet, when the faithful were scattered out of earshot, the doctor felt that the opportunity was too good to be missed, and so, while Madame Védéran was adding a final word about Vinteuil's sonata, like an inexperienced swimmer who jumps into the water so as to learn, but chooses a moment when there are not too many people looking on. "Yes, indeed. He's what they call a musician di primo cartello," he exclaimed, with a sudden determination. Swann discovered no more than the recent publication of Vinteuil's sonata had caused a great stir among the most advanced school of musicians, but was still unknown to the general public. "I know someone quite well called Vinteuil," said Swann, thinking of the piano teacher at Cambrai, who had taught my grandmother's sisters. "Perhaps that's the man!" cried Madame Védéran. "Oh, no," answered Swann, laughing. "If you had ever seen him for a moment, you wouldn't even ask the question." "Then to ask the question is to resolve it," the doctor suggested. "But it may well be some relative," Swann went on. "That would be bad enough, but after all, a man of genius may well be the cousin of a silly old fool, and if that should be so, I swear there's no form of torture I wouldn't undergo to get the old fool to introduce me to the composer of the sonata, starting with the torture of the old fool's company, which would be dreadful." The painter knew that Vinteuil was seriously ill at the moment, and that Dr. Potain was afraid that he might not be able to save him. "What?" cried Madame Védéran. "There are still people who seek treatment from Potain?" Ah, Madame Verdurin, said Cottard in a bantering tone, you forget that you are speaking of one of my colleagues. I should say, one of my masters. The painter had heard somewhere that Ventis was threatening with the loss of his reason, and he insisted that signs of this could be detected in certain passages in the sonata. This remark did not strike Swann as ridiculous, rather it puzzled him. For since a purely musical work contains none of those logical sequences, the alteration of which in spoken or written language is a proof of insanity, so insanity diagnosed in a sonata seemed to him a mysterious thing, as mysterious as the insanity of a dog or a horse, although instances may be observed of these. Don't speak to me about your masters. You know 10 times as much as he does, Madame Verdurin answered Dr. Cottard in the tone of a woman who has the courage of her convictions and is quite ready to stand up to anyone who disagrees with her. Anyway, you don't kill your patients. But Madame, he is a member of the Academy, the doctor replied in an ironic tone. If a sick person prefers to die at the hands of one of the princes of science, it is far more chic to be able to say, I am under Botin's care. Oh, indeed. It's more chic, said Madame Verdurin. So there are fashions nowadays in illnesses, are there? I didn't know that. Oh, you do make me laugh, she screamed, suddenly burying her hands in her face. And here I was, poor thing, talking quite seriously and never seeing that you were pulling my leg. As for Madame Verdurin, As for Monsieur Verdurin, finding it rather a strain to start laughing again over so small a matter, he was content with puffing out a cloud of smoke from his pipe, while he reflected sadly that he could never again hope to keep pace with his wife on the field of amiability. You should know that we like your friend very much, said Madame Verdurin later, when Odette was bidding her good night. He's so unaffected, quite charming. If they're all like that, the friends you want to meet us, by all means, bring them. Monsieur Verdurin remarked that Swann had failed all the same to appreciate the pianist's aunt. I dare say he felt it a little strange, poor man, suggested Madame Verdurin. You can't expect him to catch the tone of the house the first time he comes. Like Cottard, who has been one of our little clan for several years. The first time doesn't count. It's just for getting acquainted. Odette, it's understood that he's to join us tomorrow at the Châtelet. Perhaps you might call for him and bring him. No, he doesn't want me to. Oh, very well, just as you like, provided he doesn't fail us at the last moment. Greatly to Madame Verdurin's surprise, he never failed them. He would go to meet them no matter where, at restaurants outside Paris, not that they were there much at first, for the season had not yet begun, and more frequently at the theatre, in which Madame Verdurin delighted. And one day at her home he heard her say that for premieres and galas one of those police passes would have been very useful, and what a nuisance it had been not having one on the day of Gambetta's funeral. Swann, who had never spoken of his brilliant social relations, but only of those whose stock value was low, whom he thought it very indelicate to conceal, and whom he had acquired the habit in the Faubourg Saint-Germain to include in the latter class, all his friends in the official world of the Third Republic, answered, I promise to take care of it. You'll have it in time for the Danishef revival. I'll be lunching with the prefect of police tomorrow, as it happens, at the Élysée. What's that? At the Élysée? Dr. Cottard roared in a voice of thunder. Yes, at Monsieur Grévy's, replied Swann, feeling a little awkward at the effect that his announcement had produced. And the painter asked the doctor in a playful manner, Do you often have such spells? As a rule, once an explanation had been given, Cottard would say, good, that's all right then, after which he would show not the least trace of emotion. But this time Swann's last words, instead of the usual calming effect, raised to a fever pitch his astonishment at the discovery that a man with whom he himself was dining, a man who had no official position, no celebrity of any sort, hobnobbed with the head of the state. What's that you say? Monsieur Grévy? "Do you know Monsieur Gravy?" he demanded of Swann, in the stupid and incredulous tone of a policeman on duty at the palace, when a stranger has come up and asked to see the President of the Republic, and realizing from his words with whom he's dealing, as the newspapers say. He assures the poor lunatic that he will be admitted at once and guides him to the reception ward of the police infirmary. "I know him slightly, as we have some friends in common." Swann dared not add that one of his friends was the Prince of Wales. "Anyhow, he is very free with his invitations, and I assure you his luncheon parties are not the least bit amusing. They're very simple affairs, too, you know, never more than 8 at a table," he went on, trying to eliminate everything that seemed to show off his relations with the President in a light too dazzling for the doctor's eyes. Immediately, Cottard, accepting Swann's explanation, decided that invitations from Monsieur Gravy were very little sought after and littered the streets. And from that moment, he never seemed at all surprised to hear that Swann or anyone else had frequented the Élysée. He even felt a little sorry for a man who had to go to luncheon parties, which he himself admitted were a bore. "Ah, good. That's quite all right then," he said, in the tone of a customs official who had been suspicious up to now, but after hearing your explanations, stamps your passport and lets you pass through without examining your luggage. "I can well believe you don't find them amusing. Those parties, indeed, it's very courageous of you to go to them," said Madame Verdurin, who regarded the President of the Republic only as a bore to be especially dreaded, since he had at his disposal means of seduction, even of compulsion, which, if used on the faithful, might easily make them fail. "It seems he's as deaf as a post and eats with his fingers." "Upon my word, then, it can't be much fun for you going there." A note of pity sounded in the doctor's voice. And then, recalling the number only 8 at a table, "Are these intimate luncheons?" he inquired briskly, not so much out of idle curiosity as in linguistic zeal. But in the end, the prestige that the President of the Republic had in his eyes triumphed over Swann's humility and Madame Verdurin's spite, and he never sat down to dinner with the Verdurins without asking anxiously, "Do you think we will see Monsieur Swann this evening? He is a personal friend of Monsieur Gravy's. I suppose that means he's what you'd call a gentleman?" He even went so far as to offer Swann an invitation card to the dental exhibition. "This will let you in and anyone you take with you," he explained, "but dogs are not admitted. I'm just warning you, you understand, because some friends of mine went there once who hadn't been told, and they could have kicked themselves." As for Monsieur Verdurin, he observed the distressing effect on his wife of the discovery that Swann had influential friends of whom he had never spoken. If no arrangement had been made for a party elsewhere, it was at the Verdurins that Swann would find the little nucleus assembled, but he never appeared there except in the evenings, and would hardly ever accept their invitations to dinner, in spite of Odette's entreaties. "I could dine with you alone somewhere if you rather," she suggested. "But what about Madame Verdurin?" "Oh, that's quite simple. I need only say that my dress wasn't ready or that my cab came late. There's always some excuse." How charming of you. But Swann said to himself that if he could make Odette feel, by consenting to meet her only after dinner, that there were other pleasures that he preferred to that of her company, then the desire that she felt for him would be all the longer in reaching the point of satiety. Besides, as he infinitely preferred to Odette's beauty that of a little working girl as fresh and plump as a rose, with whom he was smitten, he preferred to spend the first part of the evening with her, knowing that he was sure to see Odette later on. For the same reason, he would never allow Odette to call for him at his house to take him on the Verdurins. The girl used to wait, not far from his door, at a street corner. Remy, his coachman, knew where to stop. She would jump in beside Swann and stay in his arms until the carriage drew up to the Verdurins. He would enter, and while Madame Verdurin, pointing to the roses that he had sent her that morning, said, "I am furious with you," and would send him to a seat next to Odette, the pianist would play for the two of them that little phrase by Venti, which was, so to speak, the national anthem of their love. He began with a sustained tremolo from the violin part, which, for several measures, was unaccompanied and filled all the foreground, until suddenly it seemed to move away, and just as in those paintings by Peter de Hooch, deepened by the narrow framework of a half-opened door. Far in the distance, of a color quite different, velvety with the radiance of some intervening light, the little phrase appeared, dancing, pastoral, interpolated, episodic, belonging to another world. It passed with simple and immortal undulations, scattering on every side the bounties of its grace with the same ineffable smile. But Swann thought that he could now discern in it some disenchantment. It seemed to know how vain was the happiness to which it showed the way. In its airy grace there was something definitely finished, consummated, like the mood of a detachment that follows regret. But little did that matter to him. He considered the sonata less in its own light, as what it might express to a musician, unaware that Swann or Odette existed when he composed it, and would express to all those who would hear it played in centuries to come. Then as a pledge, a token of his love, which made even the Védérains and their little pianist think of Odette, and at the same time of himself, which bound her to him, to such a point that he had, whimsically entreated by Odette, abandoned the idea of getting some professional to play to him the entire sonata, of which he still knew no more than this one passage. "Why do you want the rest?" she asked him. "This is our little bit. That's all we need." He went further, agonized by the thought, at the moment when it passed by him, so near and yet so infinitely remote, that, while it was addressed to them, it knew them not. He would regret almost that it had a meaning of its own, an intrinsic and unalterable beauty, foreign to themselves, just as in the jewels given to us, or even in the letters written to us by a woman with whom we are in love. We find fault with the water of the gem, or with the words of a sentence, because they are not fashioned exclusively from the essence of a fleeting intimacy and of one particular being. It would often happen that he had stayed so long outside with his little working girl before going to the Védérains that, as soon as the little phrase had been played by the pianist, Swann would discover that it was almost time for Odette to go home. He used to take her back as far as the door of her little house in the Rue La Préuse, behind the Arc de Triomphe. And it was, perhaps, on this account, and so as not to demand the monopoly of her favors, that he sacrificed the pleasure, not so essential to him, of seeing her early in the evening, of arriving with her at the Védérains, to the exercise of this other privilege which she granted him, of their leaving together. A privilege that he valued all the more because, thanks to it, he had the feeling that no one else would see her. No one would thrust himself between them. No one would prevent her from remaining with him in spirit after he had left her for the night. And so, night after night, she would be taken home in Swann's carriage. One night, after she had got down and he murmured, "Till tomorrow, then," she quickly plucked a last lingering chrysanthemum in the tiny garden that flanked the pathway from the street to her house, and as he went back to his carriage, thrust it into his hand. He held it, pressed to his lips, during the drive home. And when, after a few days, the flower withered, he locked it away, like something very precious, in a drawer of his desk. But he never entered her house. Twice only had he gone in the afternoon to take part in the ceremony of such vital importance in her life, of taking tea. The loneliness and the emptiness of those short streets, consisting almost entirely of little contiguous houses, their monotony interrupted here and there by the dark intrusion of some sinister little shop, at once a historical document and a sordid survival from the days when these neighborhoods were still ones of ill repute. The snow that had lain on the gardens or clung to the trees, the careless disarray of the season, the nearness of nature, had all combined to add an element of mystery to the warmth, the flowers that he had found on entering. Passing by on his left side, on the raised ground floor of the house, Odette's bedroom, which looked out to the back over another little street running parallel with her own, he had climbed a staircase that went straight up between dark painted walls, from which hung oriental draperies, strings of Turkish beads, and a huge Japanese lantern suspended by a silken cord from the ceiling, but which, so that her visitors would not be deprived of any of the latest comforts of Western civilization, was lighted by a gas jet. To the 2 drawing rooms, large and small. These were entered through a narrow hall, the wall of which, checkered with a garden trellis only gilded, was lined from end to end by a long rectangular box, in which bloomed, as though in a hothouse of large chrysanthemums, at that time still uncommon, though by no means so large as those that the horticulturists have since succeeded in making grow. Swann was irritated by the fashion these flowers had enjoyed for about a year, for it had pleased him on this occasion to see the shadowy light of the little room streaked with rays of pink and gold and white, by the fragrant petals of these ephemeral stars, which light up on gray winter days. Odette had received him in a tea gown of pink silk, which left her neck and arms bare. She had made him sit down beside her in one of the many mysterious little retreats that had been contrived in the various recesses of the room, sheltered by enormous palm trees growing out of pots of Chinese porcelain, or by screens on which were fastened photographs and fans and bows of ribbon. She said at once, "You're not comfortable there. Wait a minute. I'll arrange things for you." And with a titter of conceited laughter which implied that some little invention of her own was being brought into play, she had installed behind his head and beneath his feet great cushions of Japanese silk, which she had pummeled and buffeted as though determined to lavish on him all her riches, and regardless of their value. But when her footman began to come into the room, bringing one after another the innumerable lamps, which contained mostly in porcelain vases burned singly or in pairs or on the different pieces of furniture as on so many altars, rekindling in the twilight, already almost nocturnal, of this winter afternoon, the glow of a sunset more lasting, more roseate, more human, filling perhaps with romantic wonder the thoughts of some solitary lover wandering in the street below, and brought to a standstill before the mystery of the human presence that those lighted windows at once revealed and screened from sight. She had watched the servant closely from the corner of her eye to see whether he set each of the lamps down in the place appointed it. She felt that, if he were to put even one of them where it ought not to be, the general effect of her drawing-room would be destroyed, and that her portrait, which rested on a sloping easel draped with plush, would be poorly lit. And so with feverish impatience she followed the movements of this clumsy man, scolding him severely when he passed too close to a pair of jardinières, which she made a point of always cleaning herself in case someone should damage them. I went across to them now to make sure that he had not chipped them. She found something quaint in the shape of each of her Chinese ornaments, and also in her orchids, the cattleyas especially, these being with chrysanthemums her favorite flowers, because they had the supreme merit of not looking in the least like other flowers, but to be made of silk or satin. "That one looks just as though it had been cut out of the lining of my cloak," she said to Swann, pointing to an orchid with a shade of respect in her voice for so chic a flower, for this elegant, unexpected sister whom nature had bestowed on her, so far removed from her in the scale of existence and yet so refined, so much more worthy than many women of admission to her drawing-room. As she drew her attention now to the fiery-tongued chimera, painted on a bowl or stitched on a screen, now to the corollas of a bouquet of orchids, now to a dromedary of inlaid silverwork with ruby eyes, which kept company on her mantelpiece with a toad carved in jade, She would pretend now to be shrinking from the ferocity of the monsters or laughing at their absurdity, now blushing at the indecency of the flowers, or feeling an irresistible desire to run across and kiss the toad and dromedary, calling them darlings. And these affectations were in sharp contrast to the sincerity of some of her devotions, notably her devotion to the Notre Dame de Laguet, who had once, when Odette was living in Nice, cured her of a mortal illness, and whose medal in gold she always carried on her person, attributing to it unlimited powers. She poured out for Swann his tea, inquired, lemon or cream? And on his answering, cream, please, went on smiling, a cloud. And as he pronounced it excellent, you see, I know just how you like it. This tea had indeed seemed to Swann, just as it seemed to her, something precious. And love is so far obliged to find some justification for itself, some guarantee of its duration and pleasures, which, on the contrary, would have no existence apart from love, and must cease with its passing, that when he left her at 7 o'clock to go and dress for the evening, all the way home in his brougham, unable to repress the happiness with which this afternoon had filled him, he kept on repeating to himself, how pleasant it would be to have a little woman like that in a place where one could always be certain of finding that thing so rare, a really good cup of tea. An hour or so later, he received a note from Odette, and recognized at once that florid handwriting in which an affectation of British stiffness imposed an apparent discipline on its shapeless characters, significant, perhaps, to eyes less prejudiced than his, of an untidiness of mind, a fragmentary education, a want of sincerity and decision. Swann had left his cigarette case at her house. Why did you not forget your heart also? I would never have let you have that back. A second visit he paid her was more important, perhaps on his way to her house, as always when he knew that he was to see her. He formed a picture of her in his mind, and the necessity, if he was to find any beauty in her face, of fixing his eyes only on her fresh and rosy cheekbones, those cheeks that were so often languorous and sallow, sometimes marked with little red spots, distressed him as proof that the ideal is always unattainable and happiness mediocre. He was bringing her an engraving that she asked to see. She was somewhat unwell, received him, wearing a dressing gown of mauve crêpe de chine, which draped her bosom like a mantle with a richly embroidered fabric. As she stood there beside him, letting the loosened tresses of her hair flow against his cheeks, bending one knee in what was almost a dancer's pose, so that she could lean without tiring herself over the engraving at which she was gazing, with bended head out of those great eyes which seemed so weary and so sullen when there was nothing to animate her. Swann was struck by her resemblance to the figure of Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, which is to be seen in one of the frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. He had always had a peculiar fascination in finding in the paintings of the old masters not merely the general characteristics of the reality that surrounds us, but rather what seems susceptible of generalization. The individual faces of men and women whom we know, for instance, in a bust of Doge Loredan by Antonio Rizzo. The prominent cheekbones, the slanting eyebrows, in short, a striking likeness to his own coachman Remy, in the colouring of a Ghirlandaio, the nose of Monsieur de Balancy, in a portrait by Tintoretto, the invasion of the plumpness of the cheek by an outcrop of side whiskers, the broken nose, the penetrating stare, the swollen eyelids of Dr. du Bourbon. Perhaps because he had always regretted that he had confined his attention to the social side of life, to conversation by those great artists, he felt he might find a sort of indulgence bestowed on him In fact, that they also had regarded with pleasure and had admitted into their works faces like these that give those works the strongest possible certificate of reality and life. A modern savor. Perhaps also he had so far succumbed to the frivolity of society people that he felt the necessity of finding in an old masterpiece some such foreseen and refreshing allusions to people of today. Perhaps, on the other hand, he had retained enough of the artistic temperament to be able to find a genuine satisfaction in watching these individual features take on a more general significance when he saw them, uprooted and freed in the resemblance of an older portrait and a modern original, whom it was not intended to represent. However that might be, and perhaps because the abundance of impressions which he, for some time past, had been receiving, though indeed they had come to him rather through his love of music, had enriched his appetite for a painting as well. It was with an unusual intensity of pleasure, a pleasure destined to have a lasting effect on Swann, that he noticed Odette's resemblance to the Zipporah of that Alessandro de Mariano, to whom one shrinks from giving his more popular surname, now that Botticelli suggests not so much the actual work of the painter as that false and banal conception of it that has become vulgarized. He no longer based his estimate of the merit of Odette's face on the more or less good quality of her cheeks and their purely flesh-colored sweetness, which he supposed would greet his lips there, should he ever dare to kiss her, but regarded it rather as a skein of subtle and lovely lines, which his gazing eyes collected, following the curve of their winding, where he mingled the cadence of her neck with the flow of her hair and the droop of her eyelids, as though from a portrait of herself, in which her type was made intelligible and clear. He stood gazing at her. Traces of the old fresco were apparent in her face and in her body, and these he tried incessantly afterward to recapture, both when he was with Odette and when he was only thinking of her. And albeit his admiration for the Florentine masterpiece was probably based on his discovery that it had been reproduced in her, the similarity enhanced her beauty also, and rendered her more precious in his sight. Swann reproached himself for his failure hitherto to estimate at her true worth a creature whom the great Sandro would have adored, and counted himself fortunate that his pleasure in seeing Odette found a justification in his own system of aesthetics. He told himself that in associating the thought of Odette with his dreams of happiness, he was not falling back on an expedient as imperfect as he had until then supposed, since she had satisfied the utmost refinement of his taste in art. He forgot that this did not bring Odette into the category of women whom he found desirable, simply because his desires had always run counter to his aesthetic taste. The words Florentine painting were invaluable to Swann. They enabled him, as a title, to introduce the image of Odette into a world of dreams, where until then she had not had access, and where she assumed a new and nobler form. And whereas the mere sight of her in the flesh, by perpetually reviving his misgivings as to the quality of her face, her body, the whole of her beauty, weakened his love, those misgivings were swept away, and that love confirmed, now that it was founded on his aesthetic principles, while the kiss, the physical possession, which would have seemed natural and mediocre had they been granted him by a creature of somewhat withered flesh, coming as now they came to crown his adoration of a masterpiece in a gallery, must appear to him as supernatural and delicious. And when he was tempted to regret that for months past he had done nothing but see Odette, he would assure himself that it was not unreasonable to give so much of his time to the study of an inestimable masterpiece, cast for once in a different and especially delicate matter, in an extremely rare exemplar that he would contemplate at one moment with the humble, spiritual, disinterested mind of an artist, at another with the pride, the selfishness, the sensual thrill of a collector. He placed on his work table, as if it were a photograph of Odette, a reproduction of Jethro's daughter. He would gaze in admiration at the large eyes, the delicate features in which the imperfection of her skin might be surmised, the marvelous locks of hair that fell along her tired cheeks, and adapting what he had already found to be beautiful on aesthetic grounds to the idea of a living woman, he converted into physical merits that he congratulated himself on finding assembled in the one person whom he might ultimately possess. The vague feeling of sympathy that draws us to a masterpiece that we are now looking at, now that he knew the original in the flesh of Jethro's daughter, became a desire that more than compensated henceforth for the desire that Odette's body had at first failed to inspire in him. When he had gazed for a long time at this Botticelli, he would think of his own living Botticelli, who seemed all the lovelier in contrast. And as he drew toward him the photograph of Zipporah, he would imagine that he was clasping Odette against his heart.